23rd to the 26th, weather was very unfavorable during the greater part of these mornings. On account of the heavy rains, which scarcely allowed us to stir out of doors, the Emperor read a work by Miss Williams on the return from the Isle of Elba. It had just reached us from England. He was much disgusted with it, and with good reason. This production is quite calumnious and false. It is the echo and collection of all the reports invented at the time in certain malevolent Parisian societies as to our evenings. The weather was almost indifferent to us, whether it rained or the moon shone brightly. We literally made ourselves prisoners towards 9 o'clock. We were surrounded by sentinels. To meet them would have been painful. It is true that both the Emperor and ourselves might have gone out at a later hour accompanied by an officer, but this would have been rather a punishment than a pleasure to us. Although the officer never could conceive this feeling, he gave us reason to conclude at first that he imagined this seclusion to be merely the effect of ill humor, and thought it would not last long. I know not what he may subsequently have thought of our perseverance. The Emperor, as I believe I have already mentioned, sat down at table pretty regularly at 8 o'clock. He never remained there above half an hour, sometimes scarcely a quarter of an hour. When he returned to the drawing room, if he happened to be unwell or taciturn, we had the greatest difficulty in the world to get on to 9:30 or 10 o'clock. Indeed, we could not effect it without the assistance of reading. But when he was cheerful and entered into conversation with spirit, we were presently surprised to find it 11 o'clock or later. These were our pleasant evenings. He would then retire with a kind of satisfaction in having, as he expressed it, conquered time. And it was precisely on those days when the remark applied with least force that he used to observe that it must require our utmost courage to endure such a life. One of these evenings, a conversation ran on the military trials which are now instituting in France. The Emperor thought that General Drouot could not be condemned for coming in the suite of one acknowledged sovereign to make war upon another. Upon this, it was remarked that what was now mentioned at his justification would be his greatest danger at the tribunal of legitimacy. The Emperor acknowledged, in fact, that there was nothing to be said to the doctrines brought forward at this day, but on the other hand, that in condemning General Drouot, they would condemn emigration and legitimate the condemnation of the emigrants whosoever found in arms against France. The Republican doctrines punished him with death. It was not so with royal doctrine. If they should, in this instance, adopt a Republican doctrine, the emigrant and royal party would condemn themselves. The case of Drouot, however, in general point of view, is very different even from that of Ney. And besides, Ney had evinced an unfortunate vacillation of which Drouot had never been guilty. Thus, the interest which Ney had excited was wholly founded on opinion, whilst that which was felt for Drouot was personal. The Emperor dilated on the dangers and difficulties which the tribunals and ministers of justice must experience throughout the affairs connected with his return from the Isle of Elba. Above all, he was extremely struck by a particular circumstance relating to Soult, who, we were told, was to be brought to trial. He, Napoleon, knew, he said, how innocent Soult was, and yet were it not for that circumstance, and were he an individual and juror in Soult's case, he had no doubt he should declare him guilty. So strongly were appearances combined against him. They, in the course of his defense, through some sentiment which it is difficult to account for, stated, contrary to the truth, that the Emperor had said Soult was in intelligence with him. Now, every circumstance of Soult's conduct during his administration, the confidence which the Emperor placed in him after his return, etc., agreed with that deposition. Who then would not have condemned him? Yet Soult is innocent, said the Emperor. He even acknowledged to me that he had taken a real liking to the king. The authority he enjoyed under him, he said, so different from that of my ministers, was a very agreeable thing and had quite gained him over. Massena, whose prescription was also announced to us by the papers, was, the emperor said, another person whom they would perhaps condemn as guilty of treason. All Marseille was against him. Appearances were overwhelming, and yet he had fulfilled his duty up to the very moment of declaring himself openly. On his return to Paris, he had even been far from claiming any credit with the emperor. When the latter asked him whether he might have reckoned upon him, the truth is, continued the emperor, that all the commanders did their duty, but they could not withstand the torrent of opinion, and no one had sufficiently calculated the sentiments of the mass of the people. And the national impetuosity, Carnot, Fouché, Marat, and Cambacérès confessed to me at Paris that they had been greatly deceived on this point, and no one understands it well. Even now, had the king remained longer in France, continued he would probably have lost his life in some insurrection. But had he fallen into my hands, I should have thought myself strong enough to have allowed him every enjoyment in some retreat of his own selection, as Ferdinand was treated at Valençay. Immediately before this conversation, the emperor was playing at chess, and his king having fallen, he cried out, "Ah, my poor king, you are down." Someone having picked it up and restored it to him in a mutilated state. "Horrid!" he exclaimed. "I certainly do not accept the omen, and I am far from wishing any such thing. My enmity does not extend so far. I would not on any account have omitted this circumstance, trifling as it may appear, because it is in many respects characteristic. We ourselves, when the emperor had retired, reverted to the incident. What cheerfulness, what freedom of mind in such dreadful circumstances, we said, what serenity in the heart, what absence of malice, irritation, or hatred. Who could discover him, the man whom enmity and falsehood have depicted as such a monster, even amongst his own followers? Who is there that has well understood him, or taken sufficient pains to make him known?" Another evening, the emperor was speaking of his early years when he was in the artillery, and of his companions at the mess. He always delighted in reverting to those days. One of his messmates was mentioned, who, having been prefect of the same department under Napoleon and under the king, had not been able to retain his place on the return of Napoleon. The emperor, when he collected him, said that this person had, at a certain period, missed the opportunity of making his fortune through him. When Napoleon obtained the command of the army of the interior, he loaded this person with favors, made him his aide-de-camp, and intended to place great confidence in him. But this favored aide-de-camp had behaved very ill to him at the time of his departure for the army of Italy. He then abandoned his general for the directory. Nevertheless, said the emperor, when I was seated on the throne, he might have done much with me if he had known how to set about it. He had the claim of early friendship, which never loses its influence. I should certainly never have withstood an unexpected overture in a hunting party, for instance, for half an hour's conversation on old times at any other opportunity. I should have forgotten his conduct. It was no longer important whether he had been on my side or not. I had united all parties. Those who had an insight into my character were well aware of this. They knew that with me, however I might have felt disposed towards them, it was like the game of prison bars. When once the point was touched, the game was won. In fact, if I wished to withstand them, I had no resource but that of refusing to see them. He mentioned another old comrade who, with wit and the requisite qualifications, might have done anything with him. He also said that a third would never have been removed from him had he been less rapacious. We disputed amongst ourselves whether these people ever suspected the secret or their own chances, and whether the elevated station and the imperial splendor of Napoleon had fairly allowed them to avail themselves of this favorable disposition towards them. With respect to the splendor of the imperial power, the Grand Marshal said that however great and magnificent the emperor had appeared to him on the throne, he had never made on him a superior, perhaps an equal impression to that which his situation at the head of the army of Italy had stamped on his memory. He explained and justified this idea very successfully, and the emperor heard him with some complacency. But we observe what great events took place afterwards, what elevation, what grandeur, what renown throughout the world. The emperor had listened For all that, said he, Paris is so extensive and contains so many people of all sorts, and some so eccentric, that I can conceive there may be some who never saw me, and others who never even heard my name mentioned. Do you not think so? And it was curious to see with what whimsical ingenuity he himself maintained this assertion, which he knew to be untenable. We all insisted loudly that, as to his name, there was not a town or village in Europe, perhaps even in the world, where it had not been pronounced. One person in company added, "Sire, before I returned to France, at the Treaty of Amiens, your Majesty being then only First Consul, I determined to make a tour in Wales as one of the most extraordinary parts of Great Britain. I climbed the wildest mountains, some of which are of prodigious height. I visited cabins that seemed to me to belong to another world. As I entered one of these secluded dwellings, I observed to my fellow traveler that in this spot one would expect to find repose and escape the din of revolution. The cottagers, suspecting us to be French on account of our accent, immediately inquired the news from France, and what Bonaparte, the First Consul, was about. "Sire," said another, "we had the curiosity to ask the Chinese officers whether our European affairs had been heard of in their empire. Certainly," they replied, in a confused manner, to be sure, because we are totally uninterested in those matters. "But the name of your emperor is famous there, and connected with grand ideas of conquest and revolution. Exactly. The names of those who have changed the face of that part of the world have arrived in ours, such as Genghis Khan, Tamerlane, etc." The 27th, this day, the emperor was walking in the garden with the Grand Marshal and me. The conversation led us to make our political self-examination. The emperor said he had been very warm and sincere at the commencement of the revolution, that he had cooled by degrees in proportion as he acquired more just and solid ideas. His patriotism had sunk under the political absurdities and monstrous domestic excesses of our legislatures. Finally, his Republican faith had vanished on the violation of the trust of the people by the Directory at the time of the Battle of Aboukir. The Grand Marshal said that for his part he had never been a Republican, but a very warm constitutional until the 10th of August, the horrors of which day had cured him of all illusion. He had very nearly been massacred in defending the king at the Tuileries. As for me, it was notorious that I had begun my career as a pure and most ardent royalist. "Why, then, it seems, gentlemen," humorously observed the emperor, "that I am the only one amongst us who has been a Republican." "And something more, sire," Bertrand and I both replied. "Yes," repeated the emperor, "Republican and patriot." "And I have been a patriot, sire," replied one of us, "notwithstanding my royalism. But what is still more extraordinary, I did not become so till the period of the imperial reign." "How, vilain? Are you compelled to own that you did not always love your country?" "Sire, we are making our political self-examination, are we not? I confess my sins. When I returned to Paris by virtue of your amnesty, could I at first look upon myself as a Frenchman, when every law, every decree, every ordinance that covered the walls constantly added the most opprobrious epithets to my unlucky denomination of emigrant? Nor did I think of remaining. When I first arrived, I had been attracted by curiosity, yielding to the invincible influence of one's native land, and the desire of breathing the air of one's country. I now possessed nothing there. In order to be allowed only to see France once more, I had been compelled at the frontier to swear to the relinquishment of my patrimony, to accede to the laws which decreed its loss, and I looked on myself as a mere traveler in that country once mine. I was a true foreigner, discontented and even malevolent. The empire came. It was a great event. Now, said I, my manners, prejudices, and principles triumph. The only difference is in the person of the sovereign. When the campaign of Austerlitz opened, my heart, with surprise, found itself once more French. My situation was painful. I felt as if torn limb from limb. I was divided between blind passion and national sentiment. The triumphs of the French army and their general displeased me, yet their defeat would have humbled me. At length, the prodigies of Ulm and the splendor of Austerlitz put an end to my embarrassment. I was vanquished by glory. I admired, I acknowledged, I loved Napoleon. And from that moment, I became French to enthusiasm. Henceforth, I have had no other thoughts, spoken no other language, felt no other sentiments. And here I am by your side.